Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Gia, and I wanted to talk about something a little bit different today. Instead of talking about a specific book, which I will talk about a specific book, but I'd like to talk about a micro genre that I have discovered. Also, I would just like to say that I actually scripted this. I never script videos. I think I finally fixed my camera, so I might look a little bit more normal. I read a book a few months ago that had some really specific theming that I started to notice as a trend in certain books that were in the historical fiction genre, and it really opened my eyes because I started to see it more often, and I was wondering if anybody had talked about this, but I call it women's historical fiction, and I guess a little bit less seriously, I refer to it as girl boss historical fiction, and I don't mean that as an insult. Now, you might be wondering, how do you define what you consider to be girl boss historical fiction? And I consider it to be a novel whose main genre is historical fiction. It has either a dual timeline or a triple timeline. Always in timeline 1, it is a historical woman from the perspective of a woman who is dead. Timeline number 2, or timeline 2 plus, is from the perspective of a woman who is alive currently. And the novel surrounds the modern woman rediscovering, studying, or developing a close emotional or mental tie to a historical woman who is not alive in timeline 2 or 2 plus. And themes of these novels usually include but are not limited to feminism, history, misogyny in academia, historical revisionism, and mystery. The book I'm referring to is The Stolen Queen by Fiona Davis, and I will give you a brief overview of what the story is about. This will include spoilers, and I will include a little bit of a history and archaeology lesson as well, because that's what I went to school for. I've been wanting to read stories that are fictionalized archaeology stories, whether that be Empire of Shadows, which was kind of like Indiana Jones, The Amalfi Curse, which I have not spoken about yet, but in this case specifically, I want to talk about The Stolen Queen by Fiona Davis. This is a fictionalized account of a modern woman named Charlotte, who tells us her story beginning in her youth as a budding Egyptologist to her current timeline as the assistant curator of the Egyptian wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We do get these flashbacks to her youth because there is a mystery surrounding what happened to her when she was in Egypt, and again, I will be spoiling the contents of this book for the purposes of this video, but in her youth in Egypt, Charlotte came across some evidence that suggests that there was a woman pharaoh that was completely wiped from existence by her successor, and she became fixated on this for her entire professional and private life. In the modern timeline, where she is the assistant curator of the Egyptian wing, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is going to be using a lot of Egyptian artifacts. The Met Gala is going to be using a lot of artifacts from the Egyptian wing. Charlotte decides to confide in her boss about the things that she's been researching for her entire adult life. And when she does present this evidence to her boss, he dismisses her outright. He threatens her job, and he is seemingly behind the stealing of some of her documents with all of her cataloged evidence. So she had a big folder of all of her evidence that was stolen from her office. And her boss's motivation for this is that he did not want to be discredited for his own work as a long-respected associate in the field, because he was an expert in the time period that she was also talking about. So in order to keep his reputation in the field, he stole her evidence and then dismissed her so that he could remain unchallenged academically and in the historical record. And that's where I'm talking about the misogyny in academia, where working for the Met is not necessarily a academic space, but it is associated with an academic space because museums are an extension of academia, because everything we learn in academia goes to the museums. You can't really have a museum without the research that goes into building those exhibits. So that is loosely about one half of the story of The Stolen Queen, because the other half is taking place with another character in the modern timeline. She is an assistant or an associate of the Anna Wintour of this universe, trying to put on the Met Gala, and a bunch of artifacts go missing. That is not specifically the part I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk specifically about Charlotte's story, because she didn't have a PhD and she didn't have the academic reputation to back up her claims besides really good evidence evidence. And now here's your little history lesson. Don't click away. It's going to be interesting and important, I promise. The Stolen Queen is, stated by the author herself, a fictionalized account of the rediscovery of the pharaoh Hatshepsut. Her name was changed in the book. She was not named Hatshepsut in the book. Hatshepsut was the 6th pharaoh in the 18th dynasty, which is the most famous dynasty in Egyptian history for lots of reasons, including the Amarna period in art history, the fact that 2 different queens reigned as regent during this period as well, Hatshepsut and what we believe to be Nefertiti, but also King Tut was in the 18th dynasty. That's why it's the most famous period in Egyptian history. Hatshepsut ruled as regent for her stepson, which was Thutmose III. He inherited the throne when he was 2. Hatshepsut was famously depicted as a man in most of her artwork, and she wore male pharaoh regalia, including the beard attachment. She was kind of a girl boss. She emphasized to the people that she was both mother and father. Her reign was super prosperous, and several super famous buildings built in her time still stand today, like the Karnak temple complex outside Luxor, where they have filmed lots of movies. I believe they filmed part of Mummy 2 there, and Hatshepsut's own mortuary temple, which was built into a cliff outside of Luxor. She's not buried there. That is just her mortuary temple. This is where it starts to get a little bit interesting, because she died during the 22nd year of Thutmose III's reign, so when her stepson was 24 years old, and then his son after him, which I am going to butcher this probably, but Amenhotep II. During the reign of Amenhotep II, attempts were made to wipe Hatshepsut from history entirely. Her statues were destroyed, her monuments were defaced, and her achievements were ascribed to other pharaohs. Now we're going to get into the archaeology of it all. So her tomb was moved around a bunch of times, and as a result, we have not positively identified her mummy. Things that belonged to her were found in KV20, which was the Valley of the Kings, so the 20th room in Valley of the Kings. This was an extension off of the tomb of Thutmose I, who was Hatshepsut's father. So it seems that she originally extended her father's tomb so that she could be buried right next to him. Her father, Thutmose I, was later moved as well, but things that were found in KV20 that were associated with Hatshepsut, which would have been her original tomb site, included funerary furniture, a Senate board game with carved lioness-headed red jasper game pieces. That was a lot of words. A signet ring, and then a partial figurine that had her name on it. So KV20 was the site of her tomb originally, but she was moved, and then her father, who was next door, was also moved. We're going to move tombs now. So in KV60, 2 female mummies were found. One of them was identified as Hatshepsut's wet nurse, and the other remains unidentified officially, and that mummy is called KV60A. But there have been investigations into whether this is Hatshepsut herself. Examinations of KV60A show that she was between the ages of 50 to 60 at the time of her death. She was obese and in very poor health. Many of her teeth were missing or decayed, but there was one tooth that was extracted very close to her death, and they left behind a molar root on accident. This might have contributed to her death because it's possible that she had an abscess and died. She also had evidence of bone cancer that was in her left hip, and it had metastasized in her lower spine, so she had bone cancer. The orientation of her arms also associated her with royalty because her left hand was placed over her chest, but her right arm was by her side, which was thought to be a pose that marked royal women during this time. So it gets even more interesting than that. The identification of KV60A really hinges on the identification of a missing tooth, because there was a wooden box inscribed with Hatshepsut's cartouches that was found in the royal cache, which the royal cache is in the hill above where her mortuary temple is. And it's not just things that belonged to her that were found there. There were things found there that belonged to several pharaohs, but there was a box with her cartouche on it found in this place above her mortuary temple that had a tooth in it. So this royal cache, again, is carved into a cliff and is situated above Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. It contained mummified remains and funeral equipment of more than 50 kings and royal members of the New Kingdom. So they find this box with Hatshepsut's cartouche on it, and there is a mummified liver, an intestine, and a molar tooth that lacked a root. Now, what was found in KV60A's jaw? There was a missing molar with a root still in there. So the box had a molar with a missing root. The molar matched the size, shape, and density of KV60A's remaining teeth, and it lacked the same root that was in her jaw. However, we haven't officially identified Hatshepsut's mummy because they'd have to destroy the tooth in order to DNA test it. That's something I've done in a lab myself, is getting samples off of teeth to be able to test for stable isotopes, or in this case, it would be ancient DNA. Let's start to get back to the point. So the first person that proposed that KV60A was Hatshepsut was the famous Egyptologist Elizabeth Thomas, and she even wrote about it in her book in 1966. Of the mummy, nothing can be said without examination. It is merely possible to ask a question with utmost temerity. Did Thutmose III, successor and stepson of Hatshepsut, inter Hatshepsut intrusively in this simple tomb below her own? Meaning, Elizabeth Thomas believed that Hatshepsut was moved on purpose to erase her and to downplay her historical importance. Now, for what reasons, we don't know, but she was erased from history by her stepson or the son of her stepson, so it's possible there may have been some animosity that his stepmother was regent while he was a literal child because he ascended the throne at 2 years old. Family politics have always been complicated for thousands of years, so why am I not surprised? Her sarcophagus is in the Egyptian Museum, but again, her mummy has not been officially identified. What's my point? Let's get back to the point. Let's get away from the history and the archaeology of the all. What's my point? In the simplest version of events, Hatshepsut was erased from history by her successors. Her tomb was moved effectively enough that identifying her mummy is still of scholarly debate, and the first person who explicitly advocated for the identity of KV60A to be Hatshepsut was a woman. The Stolen Queen specifically aims to restore identity and agency to a fictional Hatshepsut who was erased from history by her successors, and the first person who is advocating for her reinsertion into the historical record is a woman. It is of my belief that this is a fictionalized and biographical account of the work and efforts of Elizabeth Thomas. She didn't get her doctorate, so that's why I haven't been calling her Dr. Elizabeth Thomas, just so everybody knows she did not hold a PhD, as she might have advocated for the pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 1960s. The Stolen Queen in particular focuses on how hard it is to change the scholarly record and challenge big names in academia who are the proclaimed experts on a subject. And in Charlotte's case, there was additional adversity because she was a woman advocating for another woman. And the story of the Stolen Queen takes place in the 1970s, which Elizabeth Thomas wrote in her book in 1966 about whether or not KV60A was Hatshepsut. So this is looking at about the same timeline then. The odds were that Elizabeth Thomas was probably still alive in this time period. So the Stolen Queen is probably emulating the same time period as well. Now, it is not new information for me to share that throughout history, women have had to publish under male pseudonyms to be taken seriously. This is most notably in the Bronte sisters. So for this book to focus on the theme of misogyny in academia specifically is not random. I also noted that this was a theme in A Study in Drowning by Ava Reed. I call this kind of historical fiction women's historical fiction or girl boss historical fiction because it explicitly focuses on women telling women's stories, because odds are their stories aren't being told accurately or they're not being told at all. This is where I start to go into what I was studying for my master's degree, which is something I'm still very passionate about, even if I didn't get my master's. I studied historical archaeology, which when I describe that to people, I describe it as, imagine the entirety of human history is one big book, and this one big book is written by the rich, the victors, when they say that history is written by the victors. So this big book that contains all of human history is written by the rich, the victors, the men, the literate. So where are all the chapters written by everybody else? And how do we do our best to put them in the big book of history too? So a great example of this is plantation archaeology, with archaeologists focusing on the lives of the enslaved instead of focusing on the people who lived in the big house. Anytime you see any work being done at Thomas Jefferson's estate Monticello, that is historical archaeology at work. I don't remember how many years ago it was, but it was semi-recently, within the last 3 to 5 years, that there were rooms found that used to be attached to Thomas Jefferson's private quarters, and it was just another connection to his relationship with Sally Hemings. There are still members of the white side of the Jefferson family that refused to admit that Thomas Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings. Now, I just want to say that I am not trying to minimize the validity or the importance of this. I call it a microgenre by referring to it as girl boss historical fiction, because to some people, referring to something as girl boss can come off as condescending, but that's not how I mean it. I mean like millennial hope core, like girl boss. It's just something that I've really noticed, and I've been noticing it more. And I'm really excited to read more books that are in this little micro genre. What this is, in my opinion, is a space that women authors have created that allows them to freely shed light on historical women. Honestly, I'm here for it. I can understand how some people might think it's a little bit corny. If I want to give like other examples of what I consider to be in this little micro genre, the only two books I can think of are books that I heavily disliked, or at the very least had a lot of things to say that weren't exactly positive. Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I know it's a movie now and people have really liked the movie, but I heavily disliked the book because I didn't really agree nor appreciate the representation of Shakespeare's wife as this witchy, enigmatic woman written into the form of a question mark. I don't really think that it clarified anything about her life or about her character in any way. It really just presented her as a woman who is wise beyond her years, and she's being whispered to by women in the future telling her what's going to happen. And I just didn't really agree with that representation. Obviously, I probably am the minority of that. Babylonia is the other example of a book in this genre that I don't like, because I also didn't really agree with how the characters were represented. Mostly the fact that the two main characters, who are men, are presented as half brothers, which we don't know about in the historical record, but also in a incestuous and sexual relationship with one another. And I didn't like that. I didn't like that at all. And now that I think about it, other examples of this micro genre that are books that I like would be The Lost Apothecary and The Amalfi Curse by Sarah Penner. I do really like Sarah Penner. She has a archaeology degree, I believe, so I am very attached to the stories that she writes. The only book of hers that I didn't like was The London Seance Society, but other than that, The Lost Apothecary and The Amalfi Curse are fantastic 5-star reads. Anyways, that's all from me. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you got to the end of this video, if you'd like to find me anywhere else, you can find me on Twitter and on TikTok. Remember to drink water and be nice to each other and exude kindness and empathy with everything that you do, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!